Act 1, Chapter 1, The Hollow Tide. The deer had been a clean kill, and Corran Ashe was in the kind of mood that only a clean kill put him in, which was to say, quiet, hungry, and mildly pleased with the world. He came down out of the high country with the buck slung across his shoulders, its weight settling into the ache between his shoulder blades in a way that would be a real complaint by the time he reached the valley floor and followed the sound of the river before he could see it. The Aldern ran fast and cold this time of year, swollen with the last of the mountain melt, and it cut the bramble reach in half like something had taken a blade to the land and not quite finished the job. Aldervale sat in the crook of it, walled in by two mountains and a dead forest, and on its best days, a kind of stubborn cheerfulness that had never made much sense to him, given everything. It was a good morning to be stubbornly cheerful, though. Corn was coming up green in the strip fields. Someone's goat had gotten loose again and was standing in the middle of the cart track, looking deeply unbothered about it. Smoke was rising thin and steady from the tannery and the forge both, and somewhere past the healing house, a child was laughing at a pitch that suggested trouble rather than joy. He liked the valley best in the mornings before the day had decided what kind of day it was going to be. That the big one you've been swearing at all season. Gorman called from the antler's low doorway, wiping his hands on an apron that had given up being white sometime around midsummer. It swore at me first. Corran shifted the buck's weight and did not stop walking because if he stopped, his back was going to have opinions about it. Haunch and shoulder for you, if you've got anything worth drinking this week. I've always got something worth drinking. You've got something. I didn't say worth. Gorman let out the wheezing laugh of a man who had heard every joke Corran had ever made about his ale and kept serving it anyway, and waved him on toward the smokehouse round back. That was how it worked. Mostly, it had worked for going on 10 years now. Corran brought down what the mountain gave up, and the village found uses for a man who was better with the dead things he carried out of the high passes than with almost anything he tried to do among the living. It suited him. It meant nobody expected him at council meetings, and nobody minded much when he went quiet for days at stretch. And it meant that on a morning like this one, he could walk the length of the village with a dead buck on his back and feel, briefly, like a useful piece of a machine that was working the way it was supposed to. He saw Wren outside the healing house, grinding something green in a stone mortar with more force than the herbs strictly required. He lifted a hand in greeting, and she lifted one back, the way it had been for longer than he wanted count. She had flour or ash or something pale dusted along one forearm. She was frowning at the mortar like it had said something rude to her. He thought, as he'd thought more times than he could count, that he should say something more than a raised hand one of these years, and then, as ever, did not, because there was a smokehouse to get to and a haunch to trade and a dozen other reasons that were not reasons so much as the shape caution took when it had had 34 years to practice. He was 3 streets from the granary, close enough to smell the grain dust when the horn went. It was not a sound the valley mistook for anything else. There was the low, ordinary noise of Aldervale doing its ordinary business. And then there was this, one long note off the north watchtower, cracking upward at the end like something breaking, and every single person within hearing dropped whatever they were doing. The goat in the cart track startled and bolted. Gorman was out from behind the Antlers bar before Corran had even turned around, already shouting names. Already moving toward the cellar, he kept stock for exactly this. Corran let the buck slide off his shoulders into the mud, because a dead deer was not going to save anyone's life today, and his bow was. Hollow tide. Someone was screaming it from the tower, and then more people were screaming it back down through the streets, and the whole feeling of Aldervale's morning changed all at once, all together, the way a held breath changes to a scream. 4 autumns now. Going on 5, since the first one had come down off that ridge with no warning and no explanation, and it had never once gotten easier to hear that word screamed. Some ran for the cellars without needing to be told twice, mothers snatching children up by the arm and not looking back. Others ran the wrong way on purpose, men snatching up a mattock or a fire poker or whatever else had weight and an edge, faces set with a fury that had nowhere useful to go yet. An older woman near the well didn't run at all, just stood rigid where she was, as though refusing to move might be its own kind of shelter. Somewhere behind him, A mother was already shouting a child's name into the chaos, and he did not turn to see whose child because there wasn't time and because some part of him had learned badly, brutally, that turning to look didn't help anyone. He ran for the watch line instead, stringing his bow as he went, and the valley came apart around him. They came down off the north slope the way they always came, pouring over the ridge as if the mountain itself had turned into something with teeth. He had never found a good way to describe them to himself that didn't sound like something out of fever dream, and he'd stopped trying years ago. You didn't describe the tide, you survived it. And if you had a spare breath afterwards, you drank until they stopped sitting behind your eyes when you closed them. Fast, wrong in the joints, wrong in the way they moved, like something had built them out of memory of a person and gotten it slightly, unbearably wrong. He put an arrow through the nearest one on pure reflex, and it went down and stayed down, which was the only mercy the tide ever offered anyone, that they could be killed like anything else could be killed. The Ward Watch held the line the way they always held it. Not to win, because nobody had ever won, but to buy the 10 or 15 or 20 seconds a family needed to get from a doorway to a cellar. Corran put 3 more arrows into 3 more things that had used to be people, maybe somewhere he'd never seen, and kept his eyes moving the way he always kept his eyes moving, cataloging the field before he let himself focus on any one part of it. It was a habit that had kept him breathing more times than he could count, and this morning it caught on something that made the hairs on the back of his neck go up before his conscious mind had worked out why. One of them wasn't running like the others. The rest came down in that same broken, hungry scramble, all noise and appetite. This one moved as if it were thinking. It cut left when the pack cut right, angled itself toward the Marin house with something that looked like intent, and when it took the youngest Marin boy by the arm, it didn't tear into him the way the others tore into what they caught. It simply took him, efficient as a man closing a hand around a coin, and turned and started back up the slope with the boy screaming and thrashing uselessly against a grip that didn't care. Corran put an arrow into its shoulder. It didn't stop. It didn't even slow. He had exactly enough time to be frightened of that. Really frightened, the kind that lived in the stomach before the wider chaos swallowed the thought whole, because this was how every hollow tide he'd ever survived went. 2, maybe 3 people taken and dragged off screaming, 1 or 2 more left behind in the mud who wouldn't get up again, and everyone else left standing in the wreckage wondering, every single year, why it was always exactly that much and never quite enough to end them outright. He didn't have room in his head that morning to wonder why. He had room for the boy's mother, going down on her knees in the street with a sound coming out of her that wasn't words. He had room for old Bram's voice somewhere behind him, hoarse, shouting his name. He had room for the tannery roof catching, black smoke unspooling into a sky that had been perfectly blue an hour ago. And then, because his eyes never stopped moving even when the rest of him wanted to, he had room for her. She was sitting where she always sat when the world got too loud for her, off past the last of the houses, near the black mouth of the cave nobody went into, knees drawn up, arms locked around them, absolutely still in a way that had nothing to do with calm. He knew her the way you knew someone you'd never really spoken to, Aurora, the healer's youngest patient years back for something nobody talked about, the girl who slipped out of crowds like water finding the low ground, black hair, quiet eyes, always a little apart from whatever the village was doing. She was 15 and frozen solid, and the tide was between her and every door in Aldervale that led anywhere safer than where she was sitting. Corran was already moving, fast as he could, closing the distance toward her before he'd even finished thinking it through. Up, he got a hand under her arm and hauled, and she came up off the ground like something disconnected from its own legs, eyes wide and fixed on nothing. Aurora, look at me or don't, I don't care, but you're moving. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. He had her hand, small, ice cold, gripping back hard enough to hurt once her body caught up with the rest of her, and the horde was closer than he liked between them and the village, and there was exactly one direction left that wasn't full of teeth. Nobody went into the cave. There were reasons nobody went into the cave, reasons that had had 30 years to grow into something closer to scripture than sense, and Corran had exactly as much respect for those reasons as he had time to spare for them, which was none. He put his shoulder into the panic like a man wading a current and pulled her with him, past the last house, past the place where the ground went from packed earth to broken stone, and did not look back at the smoke or the screaming or the thing that had walked away with a child like it was owed one. The cave mouth took them without so much as a shiver of protest. No wind, no warning, just dark, absolute and immediate, swallowing the daylight behind them until there was nothing left of the world but the sound of two people breathing too hard in the small, fierce, freezing grip of a girl's hand that hadn't once let go. Whether that had been the smart thing to do, Corran had absolutely no idea. He'd probably have time to regret it later, assuming there was a later.